This video is sponsored by Elements Landscape Photography magazine. Stick around to see how you can get 15% off a yearly subscription. In this week's video, we are diving deep into how to set up your camera. I am using my Sony a7R5 as an example, but if you're using Canon, Nikon, Fujifilm or any other camera, you should be able to extract a lot of information from this video. I'm going to cover what to put in your favorites menu, which functions you should turn off and on, how you set back button focusing, how you use all the different custom buttons, and much more. So let's get into it. Setting up your camera will probably not just save you a ton of time running through the menus, it will also save you a lot of frustrations, and being quick with your camera will help you in getting the photo when the fun stuff happens. I will be covering this from the perspective of a landscape photographer, and I will only briefly mention some video settings. Some of the settings I am going to cover are set as standard, but I just want to cover them to be sure. I'm not going to cover shooting techniques either, such as whether you should shoot in manual or aperture priority, or whether you should image stabilization or not. That utterly depends on the specific scene that you're photographing. And first things first, whenever you get your camera, you have to set up time and language and area. Set the time because it's going to be embedded in your EXIF files, so you definitely do not want to ignore that one. For language, I, as a Dane, prefer to have set it up in English. Most of the good resources that you have available on YouTube and on the internet in general are in English. So even if you're German, maybe even French, I know that can be controversial to say, you may consider using English. So once you started up your camera, you can go into the menu. And the first thing I would recommend is simply just to set up your favorites menu with everything that you will need. There's a good chance you do not know exactly what you're going to need. So here is everything that I have added to my favorites menu. It is super simple to go through your menu system and just add in items, and you can just follow my list. I will go into a more detailed description of the individual things that I've added later in this video. But let's dig into all the many different things you want to turn off from the beginning. Audio signals, you want to turn that off. That beeping and beep, 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 beep before you take a photo and so forth. It's super obnoxious, especially when you're out with other photographers. Auto review is also something I turn off. You do not want to look at the individual photos each time you have taken a photo. It can be super annoying, so I would suggest to turn it off. There's a function called derange optimizer in Sony cameras. It does not influence your individual photos, but it does influence the screen that you're looking at, and it can confuse what you're looking at. Derange optimizer have a tendency to brighten the screen, so you will have a tendency to underexpose your photos if you use your screen. Generally, of course, do not use your screen, but that is a risk. So turn that off. You don't need it. It's also more a videography thing. Picture profiles, turn them off. You don't need them. You shoot in RAW, you're a landscape photographer. High ISO noise reduction, you don't need that either. We noise reduce in post-processing. Long exposure noise reduction, also turn that one off. Again, we noise reduce in post-processing. Then there's the APS-C Super 35 mode. That's the DX mode on Nikon cameras. Turn that off. You never, ever need it in stills landscape photography. What it does is that it simply just changes into APS-C mode, which means that you are cropping your full frame sensor down to an APS-C sized sensor. Now, some people say that you get extra reach. Yes, but it comes with the cost of megapixels. So you would rather want to crop in post-processing than let the camera crop in the field, because you are throwing away those megapixels. So definitely never use it as a landscape photographer. Get a zoom lens. Now, one thing is camera settings, another thing is actually using those settings. If you need some inspiration, be sure to subscribe to the best landscape photography magazine available today, Elements Landscape Photography Magazine. It is a digital magazine with a huge emphasis on the fine art aspects of landscape photography. Throughout the many magazines, there is a segment called How It Was Shot, where a photographer explains a photo from their collection. There is actually a special issue of the magazine with 22 photos selected by the staff, where the photographers tell the readers the stories behind the photos. It is quite a popular issue. In issue 47, I personally really enjoyed the big and fascinating special about Elliot Porter and his work. His photos are just gorgeous and clearly demonstrate that fine art landscape photography can be both vibrant and colorful. The annual subscription is only $99 US, but with my code down in the description of the video, you can get 15% off and get access to the current issue, the next 12 issues, and all prior issues. Yes, you heard that right. A big recommendation from me and Pixels and many other readers of the magazine. Be sure to use the coupon code down in the description of the video. So let's jump into what you want to turn on. And let's start with lens compensation. I've generally set everything on auto. If there are profiles for individual lenses in the camera's firmware or in the lens firmware, then you want to apply that. It's simply just from the factory. They have put in some compensations for the specific lens design. Separate display, I use it all the time, so I have that turned on. And the separate setting, I've set it at 100. I go into more details with the separate settings in the video that I put up here in the corner. And I also use the anti-dust function so that the shutter blades pull down whenever I turn off the camera, so that when I change the lens, the sensor is protected from getting dust on it. The downside is that if you are in a dust storm, then those dust particles can get stuck in the shutter blades. And that is probably even worse because you risk ruining your shutter blades. And if you do that, your camera is totaled. You have to decide yourself whether to use it or not. I use it generally because I do not shoot in dust storms or change lenses in dust storms. Then there's the power settings option, where I generally have the auto monitor off, and power save, I start that at 2 minutes. For the different file types I shoot in, I do some video, and here I use the format XAVC S4K. For photo, I always shoot in RAW, and I shoot in lossless compression large. There's several videos on YouTube that go into the different formats and why you should shoot in what, and most people conclude that lossless large has the best quality to file size ratio. You basically don't lose any image quality whatsoever in lossless, and you get the smallest possible files. I often bracket my photos, so I take 3 photos, one which is like a normal exposure, one which is underexposed, and one which is overexposed, and then I put those together as an HDR file, so I get even more dynamic range in the file that I post-process. I always have a self-timer setting of 2 seconds in the bracket settings, and I always go from the regular exposure to the underexposure to the overexposure. Some people prefer to have the underexposed photo, the normal exposed photo, and then the overexposed photo, but that is completely up to you. Many newer cameras can do what's called focus bracketing or focus stacking within the camera. So it takes a lot of photos where it changes the focus throughout the scene, and then in post-processing, you have to put it together yourself. For me, I have set my settings so that the first photo is the photo where the focus is closest to the camera, and then it changes until it reaches infinite focus. I also have exposure smoothing on. The shooting interval is shortest, and I do not use a special folder for my focus brackets. You can set it up so you have your focus brackets in a specific folder on your camera. I simply just have focus bracketing along with all my regular shoots. And speaking of editing, if you struggle with editing your photos, be sure to subscribe to my huge post-processing course, Photoshop for Landscape Photographers. It is in this 20+ hours, 30+ videos course that I share everything I know about editing as a landscape photographer. How to clean your photos properly, how to work with atmosphere, how to work with glow, how to use luminosity masks to blend your photos, to edit with luminosity masks, advanced blending, everything to your heart's desire about how I edit my photos. You can get $45 off via the coupon code down description of the video. Then we have metering mode. For me, that is a set and forget function. I use the metering mode multi, and I have an entire video where I go into why metering modes doesn't really matter in landscape photography. I'll link it up here also. In the focusing menu, I always set subject recognition in autofocus on. I have auto magnifier in manual focus on. This means that if I am in manual focus and I turn my focusing ring on the lens, then the preview kicks in. It magnifies the photo without me having to touch anything besides the focusing ring. It's very, very helpful because you want to zoom in whenever you're going to focus anyway. So you may as well just put it on. I don't have any limits on the focus magnifying time. I want to reset it myself, because sometimes if you only set it to like 2 seconds or something like that, and you look on it and you're like, oh, is it in focus? I can't really decide. And then it goes back and then you have to refocus to get in. It's just annoying. So I have it on no limit. My initial focus magnifying on my Sony camera here is on 4.7. In that way, it kicks in immediately. So I don't have to press 2 times to zoom all the way in. I can only press once. And I have autofocus in magnification set on 2. The reason for this is how I usually focus. So I find whatever I want to focus on. I set the little square via the joystick where I want to focus. Then I magnify whatever I want to focus on. And then I focus with my back button, focus. And speaking of back button focusing is easy to set up. The first thing we need to do is to find the function called autofocus AF with shutter and put that to off. So now we have removed autofocus from the shutter button. So when you click your shutter button up here, it does not focus. However, we do of course need to focus, so we need to apply that function to another button on the back side of the camera, therefore back button focusing. And remember how we applied the custom key set function for photo to our favorites menu. So now we go up back into that one, and then on Sony cameras, on the rear, number 1, the AEL button, that is where I have put my back button focus, and it's called autofocus on, AF on. So now that when you are in focus mode, you can click on that one and then your camera ought to focus. And I of course also have a video where I discuss the benefits of back button focusing versus manual focus versus autofocus. You can check that one out too. So these were all the initial settings. From here, let's just go in and choose all our custom buttons. And of course, if you use Canon or Nikon, then you can maybe get some inspiration from this section too. So on the first, I put autofocus on. On the second, that's one called AF on. Yeah, I know I've switched the 2 functions around. I use focus magnifier. On my number 3, C1, I have white balance. On number 4, all the way over here, C3, I have focus mode. I honestly don't really use that much. And on number 5, the garbage bin, I have the interval shooting, that's C4. For the next one, if I press my joystick down, I use bright monitoring. Admittedly, I don't use that a whole lot either. It's only during night photography I use that. Number 2, it's not set, I just have it as a standard. It's the display button where you just rotate through the different displays on your screen. Keep that, it's a good idea to have that. Number 3, drive mode, so I can easily change between continuous shooting, single shot, and so forth. Number 4 is ISO. I just press that and then I can change my ISO. You will also see that these buttons are standard on a Sony camera. And on number 5, I have monitor brightness. When I click on that, I can change between the different brightness settings on the screen. On the top of the camera, I have movie shooting, obviously on the record button. And on custom button 2, I have my focus area. And the last one is the lens. I don't really ever use the lens buttons. So right now it's just the standard focus hold. On the dials and wheels menu, I just have the standard parts. Although on number 4, I have put ISO. So that means that I can just change the ISO by turning the wheel. I don't even need to press the custom button to change my ISO. Since this is about photography, I just skip the video part here. But if we go into the custom key settings for playback, there is one thing I find to be very, very important. And that is on my custom key C3, that is number 2 here in the menu, I put rating. So that when I look through my photos and I'm like, remember this one? I usually just click that one and that gives it a star. So when I put all my photos into Bridge or Lightroom, then that photo is already marked with a star. It's just so that I remember that that is a photo I need to remember. You can also use it to select which one is the first photo of a focus bracket or the first photo of a panorama, and so on and so forth. It's simply just a way to mark your photos in the field so you remember that there's something you need to remember when you're back in post-processing. I also just very fast want to go through some of the different functions I added to the favorites menu. The first one is I use interval shooting all the time. I use it to photograph myself from a distance. So I just set up the interval shoot function in some way or another, shooting start time, shooting interval, number of shots, and so forth. Number of shots, I usually just have it like to 2000 because I just want to have the camera keep shooting. My shooting start time depends how far I think I will need to walk into the scene. And then I usually have an interval of about 6 to 7 seconds if I photograph myself. This here is also, of course, the time-lapse function. So if you want to make a time-lapse, you use that one too. Then there's the select finder or monitor. I usually have that on auto. So when I look on my camera here, I have my monitor, but sometimes I need to take my eye up and then it just changes automatically to the finder. Sometimes you want to just log in the monitor and sometimes you just want to log in the finder. So that's why it's in my favorites menu so I can easily access it. Monitor brightness I also have in my favorites menu. Yes, I did put it as a shortcut on the back buttons, but I like to have it in my favorites menu too. Audio record levels, I use that for my videography so I can change the levels of my audio recordings. It's in the name. Anti-dust function, I want to be able to access it so I can easily sensor clean or change whether the shutter blades turn down when I turn off the camera on and off. Then I've added the bulb settings to the first one here. After I've got my new filters, I've started to use it for making a little bit more long exposure. So it's nice to be able to change the bulb function relatively fast. Remember on Sony cameras, if you want to access the bulb menu or the bulb function, then you have to do it from manual and you need to have the drive mode single shooting. And then you need to turn off silent mode. So you're not in silent mode. Not before you have put in these 3 settings can you enter bulb mode through manual. Then I also have my format setting. It can be dangerous to have so easy access to it, but I generally have a tendency to format my cards whenever they are full, and I've of course backed up my cards. It's a good way to make sure that your SD cards keep functioning. For the same reason, you shouldn't just like pull them out of the computer when you're done with them. Take care of your SD cards and they will take care of you. I have never ever had SD card failures. In the second menu, I have my NTSC PAL selector. Again, it's a video function where you change the standard frames per second in your video shooting. Then I also want to easily be able to access the APS-C mode, simply just so that I can check if it's on or off. Then I can go into my function FN menu settings and change those around. I will cover that in a moment. Then I have access to my custom key dial sets. On the third menu, I've just added a few different other things that I may or may not need. I rarely use these settings, but they're there, so I have access to them relatively simply. And speaking of light, about a month ago, I released my brand new ebook after 5 years of work. In these 251 pages, I dig into everything I know about light and how to use it in landscape photography. There's so many different subgenres and types of light throughout the day that you need to know about as a successful landscape photographer. You need to know the impact of color. You need to know the impact of how post-processing work with light, and how post-processing is not a way to get a successful photo if you do not nail the light in the field. In the final chapters, I put it all together, what we've learned throughout the ebook. And in the very final chapter, it's like a bonus chapter, I have some final thoughts that didn't really fit in other places in the ebook. I've also added an extensive amount of EXIF data to all the different photos throughout the ebook, so that you can see not just the regular EXIF data like shutter speed, aperture and ISO, but also whether a photo is focus stacked, time blended, and what kind of filter I've used. With minimal text and the tons of examples, I get to the point fast, and make sure to get the bundle where you also get my 2 ebooks on composition if you struggle with composition. There are links to everything and the free light versions of the 3 ebooks down in the description of the video. The last thing I want to cover, on Sony cameras, you have the function key. It's like a small menu that you can access, and then you can choose the different other settings that you may not have applied to the rest of the camera. You can of course also put in the functions that you use regularly or something like that. I have a tendency, I'm really bad at using the shortcuts on the camera, so my drive mode is actually the first in my shooting function menu. But what you can do is you simply just go in and then just add the different functions that you like to have relatively easy access to in your function menu. And you can see for my function menu in the shooting profile, I have my drive mode, focus area, ISO. Again, I never access ISO through that. Exposure compensation, my touch operation on and off, my interval shooting, my recognition target, my steady shot, pixel shift multi-shoot. I never use it, but I don't know, then I have it, I guess. My silent mode, and my record media settings, so I can change between the 2 SD card slots. And likewise in the video function menu, I have added a few different things also that I may or may not need. Be sure to use the links down in the description of the menu to get 15% off an annual subscription from Elements magazine. If you want to learn more about light or composition or editing your photos, be sure to check out my educational material too. Whether you use Nikon, Canon, Sony, Fuji or any other camera, I hope you got some inspiration for how to set up the different settings in your camera. See you next time, which according to my schedule should be Japan.